Good day. This is the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, Texas. My name is Luther Elmore. These public forums are held most Sundays here at our church, 4700 Grover Avenue in north central Austin. This church has been holding these forums since we first incorporated in 1954, and we believe it is the longest continuously serving public affairs forum in the state of Texas. These are held most Sundays here at our church, and we invite you to come join us. If you have questions of our speakers, then you can ask those questions yourself. For information about that, please go to our website. That is austinuu.org. Today, we're delighted to have with us Mr. Gil Starkey. Gil is a native of Virginia and a graduate of Virginia Tech, where he received a BS in biology. He worked in the electronics industry for 40 years, although that is amazing since he does not appear to be old enough to have done that. But he claims he's worked in the electronics industry for 40 years. Nevertheless, Gil and his wife, Bobby Sukahara, moved to Austin in 2000 to be near their children and grandchildren. Just before retiring from their respective professions, Gil and Bobby co-founded an Austin chapter of the national organization 350.org. This is a progressive environmental organization, and Bobby and Gil are very active here in the Austin community with that. Gil currently serves as a member of the board of directors for 350 Austin, and we'll welcome him to our Public Affairs Forum today. Mr. Starkey.
Thank you very much, Luther, for that gracious introduction, and I'd like to thank you and the First UU Church for this opportunity to speak today. I knew this was probably the longest public affairs forum in the city of Austin. I had no idea this was probably the longest in the state, but that does make sense. Congratulations, that's quite an accomplishment. This is just my humorous way. For the radio audience, I have a slide up that says, "This program contains mature content. Viewer discretion is advised." And I'm saying that because I intend to present as unvarnished a view of climate change and the challenges that it faces or presents to us. I'm not going to fudge the data to make it sound like that we have less of an extreme situation or an urgent situation than we do. Unfortunately, some official reports, and I understand one coming out from the UN in the next couple of weeks, may have done that in its executive summary, which unfortunately the policymakers will use. Nor will I rely on the hope of pulling some miracle technology out of the hat. And one reason I'm not going to do that is it's not required. But nevertheless, this is serious material, so be forewarned. I basically want to cover three things with you today. First is a really brief introduction to the number 350 and 350.org and 350 Austin, and then to settle into the meat of the presentation, in which I'll talk through an overview of the global climate and its expected impacts here in Austin, and then finally what 350 Austin is trying to do in this context and in the overall global climate change movement. So first, as you can see on this slide, there's 350 everywhere. 350.org, 350 Austin, 350 Japan, 350 Seattle. Everywhere you look is 350. Does anybody know what the significance of that number is?
Now it's at 400, 405. Maybe we should rename it.
That's correct. 350 represents the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere expressed in parts per million, below which we can have a stable climate. Now, actually, he just stole my thunder. Where we are right now, as of our last official measurement at the end of end of August, is right at 407 parts per million. So we are well beyond the safe threshold, and I would submit that we have kicked the global climate out of equilibrium and are in danger of bringing serious climate change upon us. So then I think 350 represents two things, really. One is to remind us of just how far into dangerous climate territory we have wandered. And secondly, to remind us of what we need to get back to. We need to get back below 350, actually, because it is believed to be a threshold of safe climate. So with that said, what about 350 organizations? 350.org itself is a global grassroots climate change movement, citizens movement, to stop and reverse climate change. Now, 350 Austin is a local affiliate of that global group. We believe, think of us as sort of the boots on the ground in Austin and Central Texas to carry out the mission of 350.org. We believe that we're in a very strategic location here, being in Austin, Texas, the very heart of the oil patch, the capital of carbon. Now, with that brief introduction on 350s, I want to focus now on the state of the climate, looking really at 4 topics. One is climate change trends, then feedback loops. I also want to talk a moment about climate math, and finally then move into climate change expectations for the city of Austin. Climate change is a physical phenomenon. It seems like in the current environment I have to say that when it should be fairly obvious. It is a physical phenomenon. It's really just chemistry and physics in action. That's what climate change is. If we change the chemical composition of the atmosphere by pumping huge amounts of heat-trapping gases into that atmosphere, the world warms up. Just like if you have a pot of water sitting on your stove and you turn the heat on underneath it, the water will get hotter. Anything that retains more heat than it radiates gets warmer. It's a simple fact of the physical universe in which we live. That greenhouse gases drive global warming and climate change really is not disputed in the scientific community. Neither is the cause of climate change disputed scientifically. By that I mean at least 97% of climate scientists publishing the results of their research in peer-reviewed research journals agree that climate change is happening now and that human activity is driving it, specifically human emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, this slide, sometimes called the hockey stick, it shows a graph of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the past 400,000 years. Notice that in that time, the concentration never exceeded 300 parts per million. But then the Industrial Revolution came along and our greenhouse gas emissions skyrocketed. We are now adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at a rate that is 10 times faster than anything that has been seen on Earth in the past 66 million years since the dinosaurs went extinct. As a result, the Earth is getting warmer. 9 of the 10 hottest years on record have occurred since 2004. Now, it's true that 2017 was not hotter than 2016 or 2015, but the fact that it is the 3rd hottest year on record is very disturbing. Why? Because it is the hottest year by far ever that was not augmented by an El Nino in the Eastern Pacific. Most of the carbon dioxide and the temperature change that we have witnessed thus far have occurred since 1980. Less than 40 years ago. And our greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase year after year. In absolute terms, we add at least 32 to 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere every single year. It's also very sobering to realize that greenhouse gases do not exert their full influence immediately. Carbon dioxide, for example, takes 30 to 40 years to absorb all the heat that it's going to retain. So what that means is that we are seeing the full effects of the CO2 that was emitted back in the 1980s and only partial effects of everything since then. So in my mind, that raises the question, well, how much global warming is safe? It wasn't very long ago that it was widely believed that keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius as above pre-industrial averages was probably okay. But that attitude has now changed, and we now see a 2 degree centigrade warming as risky, especially because our knowledge of the climate and of feedback loops has become much more refined. And therefore, as you will remember, I'm sure, from the Paris climate meetings back at the end of 2015, the nations of the world agreed that they would try to keep warming to or below 1.5 degrees Celsius because that was a much more prudent threshold and a safer one. However, as we look forward to what's happening in climate change, there are many who expect us to blow through the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming in the 2030s, and then to blow through 2 degrees Celsius warming a little later in this century. So far, we've raised the average global temperature by a little more than 1 degree Celsius. And I want to have just a really brief look. A lot of this I know you're familiar with, but just a brief look at some of the impacts that 1 degree centigrade rise in temperature has brought us. And these are just a few. Obviously, temperatures are beginning to rise. Ocean temperature continues to increase along with ocean acidification. We're having all kinds of population displacements, not only in the animal kingdom of species moving north in the northern hemisphere, but climate refugees around the world, also resulting from wars and civil instability, sometimes fomented by climate change, such as the civil war in Syria, which was really preceded by an historic drought in that ancient country, an historic drought that drove about 1.5 million people from their homes in the countryside because their farms were dead and they couldn't get water. They went to the cities, and that created a real problem. These are many other situations here. I won't take time to go through that, but every single one of these and more are happening now and will just get worse every year. One of my pet peeves is I sometimes hear somebody say about some climate disaster like a hurricane or something, especially powerful hurricane, that these effects are the new normal. I don't think that's quite accurate, because that to me implies that, yeah, our situation has deteriorated, but we've reached a new stasis just with more severe weather events than we're accustomed to. I think the new normal should be stated something like this, and I'm assuming, of course, we continue on our current path. The new normal means that we are in a constantly deteriorating climate in which we can expect increasingly severe weather. So that what we're seeing now is as good as it's going to get. That's the new normal. And that's being produced with just 1 degree Celsius rise in average global temperature. But we're on the way to a much, much greater rise than 1 degree centigrade. Our current trajectory is shown on this graph, which really maps out 4 different climate scenarios, and I want to take a moment to explain this graph. It shows the expected global temperature increases under specific emission scenarios, and these scenarios, which are called representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, were developed under the supervision of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, for the purpose of facilitating climate change modeling. Each RCP contains a discrete set of assumptions, standards, and databases that serve as a starting point for an agreed upon starting point for climate modeling. Now, I really want to call the attention to RCP 8.5, which is the red line on this graph. This scenario assumes basically that we continue to burn fossil fuels as we have in the past. The black dots that you see climbing up one of those lines, and it's actually climbing up the red line, are actual historical measurements. They are following RCP 8.5, and that line would lead us, unless we change, to somewhere between 4 to 6 degrees Celsius warming in this century. Even the Paris Accords, even those, if everybody does what they said they were going to do, will still lead us to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius rise this century. That's essentially the green line on this graph. Let me back that up for a second. So how serious is this situation? I want to quote Professor Neil Adger, who is an expert on climate change adaptation at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research in the United Kingdom. And he says, and I quote, There is no science on how we're going to adapt to 4 degrees Celsius warming. The implications of 4 degrees of warming show that the impacts are so significant that the only real adaptation strategy is to avoid that increase at all costs because of the pain and suffering that it's going to cause. End quote. Some climate scientists not only agree with that, but fear that 4 degrees of warming could in fact produce runaway, uncontrollable, irreversible, catastrophic climate change. But we're on a trajectory that takes us to 4 to 6 degrees centigrade. And that reminded me, I'm maybe a bit older than I was given credit during the introduction. During the 1970s, the cartoon character Pogo, upon observing the environmental desolation of his own day, said, "We have seen the enemy," or "we have met the enemy, and he is us." And I think he's right on with that. The bottom line that I'm trying to get to here is that we must get off fossil fuels fast. And doing that will require massive effort to transition from our current fossil fuel infrastructure to a new carbon-free energy infrastructure. A lot of people think that will take decades. But my point in this is that we're running out of time. The window of opportunity to avoid catastrophic climate change is rapidly slamming shut. So that raises the question of what kind of leeway do we have going forward at this point? That brings us to climate math. The purpose of climate math is to calculate how much fossil fuel we can still burn, that's our carbon budget, while remaining below a target temperature. The original climate math from 2012 was based on the proven reserves as reported by the fossil fuel industry itself, some 2,795 billion tons of carbon. And these fossil fuel companies are actually carrying these proven reserves on their books as financial assets. That has a rather serious implication we'll get to later. If we were to have a reasonable hope of staying below 2 degrees Celsius warming, according to this exercise, these calculations show that we could not possibly burn more than 565 billion tons of carbon. The fossil fuel industry's proven reserves are nearly 5 times the carbon budget. And what that means in practical terms is that at least 80% of those reserves must stay in the ground. The problem here, as one who spent his life working for Fortune 150 companies, is that no corporation is going to walk away from money like that. How big is the money? Well, J.P. Morgan calculated the value of these proven reserves to be $27 trillion. That was trillion with a T. And that's why I say no corporation is going to walk away from that. Nor, for that matter, is any nation likely to do that. As Justin Trudeau, the supposedly progressive Prime Minister of Canada, has openly said. The new climate math from 2016 looked not at proven reserves, but on what is actually being removed from the ground now through active mines and active oil and gas wells. And that came out to be, again, using fossil fuel industry data, 942 billion tons of carbon. Now, even by lowering the probability of success, in the old math, they took 80% probability of success, which left 20% probability of failure, which we can talk about later. But in these new calculations, they lowered the acceptable risk down to 66% to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, or 50% to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the carbon budget, you can see here, is either 800 gigatons or billion tons for staying below 2 degrees, or only 353 billion tons to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade. So what we're seeing here is that in order to have any reasonable hope of keeping the climate from getting too warm for life to flourish, we can't even burn what is currently being extracted from the ground. We can't burn all of that. And yet the fossil fuel industry continues to spend billions of dollars every year to go look for more of it. Climate math calculates how much carbon we can theoretically burn and stay below a target temperature, but it does not deal with feedback loops. A feedback loop occurs when the output of a process serves as the input to another process, the output of which feeds as an input back to the original process, like this AB process depicted here. This is a very simple one, only 2 steps, but the idea still applies. It's essentially a vicious circle. And what we're trying to say here, and what the scientists in this report that I lifted this graphic from, showing a multiple, I think about 15 different feedback loops in the global climate system and the interrelationships between them, is that global warming is what drives and activates and then drives these feedback loops, which in turn, as a feedback loop, drives more global warming, which just makes the situation worse. Many such feedback loops exist in the global climate system, as this slide depicts, but they also interrelate with one another. They exacerbate each other. Now, most of these, or many of them anyway, certainly are already activated, although we do not think at this time that any of them are out of control. What the great concern here is, nobody knows where the thresholds are for these feedbacks that, once crossed, will produce runaway climate change over which we have no control. These processes, talking about the whole body of them here, literally have sufficient potential that they could make the earth uninhabitable. So far, governments and the public have not paid a lot of attention to this. But I want to take one example, and that's permafrost thaw, and look at it for just a moment. This gaping hole that you see here is a blowhole in Siberia that was created by the violent release of gases, primarily carbon dioxide and methane, that had formerly been locked in the permafrost in the form of hydrates. And a hydrate is essentially a lattice work of ice crystals that trap gas molecules within it and keep them from escaping into the atmosphere. But obviously, as the permafrost thaws, the ice crystals melt and the gas is released. Now, to appreciate the threat of permafrost thaw and the methane that is involved in that thaw, the release of that methane, we need to understand the concept of global warming potentials, or GWPs. Greenhouse gases do not all warm the earth the same amount. And that means, so what we need to do then is to find some baseline to compare the warming effects of a specific greenhouse gas and understand its impact across the climate. And that's the idea behind global warming potentials. The base gas is carbon dioxide, which, as the base, automatically has the value of 1, a global warming potential of 1. Notice that methane's GWP is 25 over a 100-year period. Now that means that methane warms the earth 25 times as much as an equal amount of carbon dioxide per unit. So we're talking gigatons of release in these things. 1 gigaton, or 1 billion tons of methane, warms the earth to the same amount as 25 billion tons of carbon dioxide. The fly in this ointment is that methane doesn't live in the atmosphere for 100 years. Its atmospheric lifespan is really only about 12 years. So when you consider its actual lifespan in the atmosphere, it has the potential of warming the climate more on the order of 100 times that of carbon dioxide. There's a huge amount of methane hydrate in the tundra and in the Arctic Ocean that is, in fact, being released right now. The amount of that methane, of course, is not unknown, but it's estimated to be somewhere around 1.5 trillion tons. So that the release of even a small amount of this, with the warming potential that it has, could be disastrous for us. From this photo, you can see some idea of the scale of this particular release by noticing the 3 researchers standing on the opposite lip of this crater. And some of these craters are not only big across like this, I think this one, I forgot how many meters across it is, but some of them are more than 200 feet deep as well. That is a lot of gas. So my thesis actually in this whole talk is this, that we're in a climate crisis. and we are unleashing forces which human beings cannot control. We can control greenhouse gas emissions, which trigger these things, but we cannot control feedback loops. Now, with that overall situation, let's look at the situation here in Austin. Obviously, one impact of climate change and global warming is our temperatures are going to rise. This particular chart is from the Climate Resilience Action Plan for the City of Austin, which our Sustainability Office here in Austin just released back in April of this year. This is based on modeling that Catherine Hayhoe from Texas Tech University helped them do. Now, basically what I want to point out here is that with respect to our temperatures, there are three key temperature parameters that are going to be impacted, and they are the average summer temperature, the average number of summer days with highs above 100 degrees, and the average number of days with highs above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. These are Fahrenheit figures. I want to focus on mid-century because several reasons. One, it's possible, when you notice the date range of what they consider to be mid-century, 2041 to 2070, it's possible that I may still be alive at the beginning of that period. Not overly likely, but possible. However, my children will be, barring some tragedy. And my grandchildren will just be entering what I would consider mature adulthood, but the oldest one being in his early 40s at this point. Now, real quickly, what I want to focus on is those three parameters. Notice that in this first column to the right of the parameters, a historical observed value. That comes from looking back over all of our temperature data for as long as we've collected it here in Austin, which goes back, I think, to the 1880s. The average summer high historically has been about 94 degrees. But notice by mid-century, that's expected to be the average temperature to be 100 degrees. The number of days exceeding 100 degrees historically has been about 12. But we expect that to be 5 times as much, more than 60 days, 2 months in excess of 100 degrees by mid-century, assuming our emissions continue on the same path. The number of very hot days historically was so low, this is when we exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit, that was so rare that it didn't even come out to be, on average, 1/10 of a day per year. But by mid-century, we expect about 12 days per year, on average. Another climate change impact will be drought. The Austin Water Department has analyzed the annual inflows to the Highland Lakes, which are our city's water supply. And they found that all 5 of the lowest inflow years in the history of those lakes have occurred since 2006, and that 8 of the 12 lowest inflow years have also occurred in that same time frame between 2006 and now. Climate change is expected to exacerbate this problem because our droughts that we're going to see are going to get longer and more severe. Similarly, we expect flash flooding to increase. We have a big enough problem with that in Central Texas right now, but climate change models show that it will probably increase. One of the main reasons for that, and this is a general characteristic of climate change globally, is that storms are getting more intense, so they drop more rain than they used to. The Atlas 14 study, which was conducted by the National Weather Service, is a very extensive study, predicts that our major storms will drop 33% more water than they have in the past. Now, what that means practically, this chart shows, because what had once been a 100-year flood is likely to occur on a frequency of about every 25 years, so about 4 times more frequently than what we've seen in the past. And what had been a 500-year flood is likely to occur on average about every century. This is why the floodplain maps are being redrawn in the city of Austin. There are additional impacts as well, just listing 3 here: increased evaporation, stress on energy demand, and stress on the electricity grid, and multiple health effects. We'll get into that one if you're interested in Q&A. But these are 3 more serious impacts that we have to face right here in Austin. I want to pick on the increased evaporation because that is another threat to our water supply. Evaporation is going to increase because our summers are getting longer and hotter. And it's important to note that right now we lose as much water from the Highland Lakes to evaporation as the entire city of Austin uses in a year. So we lose as much as we use under current conditions. The electricity grid is extremely important as well because the higher temperatures, and particularly the life-threatening high temperatures, over 100 and over 110 degrees, will cause a much greater demand for electricity and therefore stress on the grid. These heat conditions pose truly a life and death threat to vulnerable populations here in the city, such as the homeless, the poor, the very young, and the elderly. Climate impacts this severe and on this scale require preparation by the whole society. But even if we do everything right to prepare for this, we cannot continue greenhouse gas emissions under our present business as usual approach. That will lead to disaster. We must recognize that we're in a climate crisis and begin to take serious action before it's too late. So the question then is, what is 350 Austin doing in this situation, in this environment? 350 Austin agrees with the global 350.org organization that intense efforts on the level of the federal government right now is basically futile. We also recognize that Texas state legislature is pretty well owned by the fossil fuel industry as well. So we have decided that we're going to focus our efforts locally on the city of Austin and the Central Texas region. One of the campaigns that we have just begun is called Fossil Free Faster. It builds on the city of Austin's, or the city council's 2014 resolution that stated Austin Energy's electricity generating infrastructure is to be 100% renewable by 2030. Now you may recall, if we keep on the same path we're going, we're going to be blowing through 1.5 degrees, which is a pretty safe limit for global warming, at about that same time. So our position is that's too late. We need to get there sooner and not delay another, what would that be, 12 years to get to fossil-free infrastructure. Note that according to Austin Energy's 2017 annual report, 64% of their generation infrastructure right now, 64% of it is non-renewable. That leaves only 35% that is fossil-free. That's an awfully big hill to climb in 12 years. What I'm showing here is a slide from Austin Energy's report to the Electric Utility Commission earlier this summer, in which they track the deployment of renewable energy generation sources from 2011 out to 2025. There's three things I want to point out about this slide. First of all is that fact that it only goes to 2025, and yet the City Council has mandated 100% by 2030. Secondly, you'll notice a very disturbing leveling off and even decline in percentage of renewable energy generation after this year. And thirdly, by 2025, Austin Energy is only targeting 55% renewable infrastructure at that point. What they don't show, because they didn't extend the graph that far, is they're also aiming to be 67% renewables by 2027. However, even if they meet those two goals, that still leaves 1/3 of their energy generation infrastructure to be converted to fossil-free in less than 3 years. Now, here's some additional observations that we have made. One is that Austin Energy, to our knowledge, and we may be wrong about this, so correct me if we are, but to our knowledge, Austin Energy has never really publicly embraced fossil-free by 2030. Secondly, we have noticed that often Austin Energy only talks about goals which are aspirational targets. They do not talk about, nor have I ever heard them reference, concrete plans that will enable them to reach any of these goals. And therefore, as best as we can determine, there is no defined step-by-step plan with intermediate milestones that will help them reach these goals as the City Council has mandated. There's an old saying we've all heard, aim at nothing and you're sure to hit it. That may not be fair in Austin Energy's case. I think it may be more accurate to say, make no commitment to the goals, fail to plan on how you're going to accomplish those goals, and you're sure to miss the target. 350 Austin does not and will not accept that kind of approach to a fossil-free energy generation infrastructure. So, how are we going to go about trying to get us to where we need to be? To accomplish our goals, we're going to follow a classic inside-outside strategy. Now, by inside strategy, I mean we intend to work closely and cooperatively with the mayor, the city council, city commissions like the Electric Utility Commission, the Joint Sustainability Commission, and others, and Austin Energy itself. We want to work with all of these folks together to reach these goals as soon as we possibly can. But if cooperation fails to make significant progress and timely progress toward these goals, we will go outside the system to bring pressure on decision makers in order to break through that resistance. And the pressure I'm talking about is using nonviolent direct action techniques and tactics. I don't have time to get into NVDA here, but if you are interested and not familiar with that, please ask about it in the Q&A. Another classic inside strategy, although this one does not apply to Austin Energy, is divestment. Pension fund divestment on the global level, a campaign that actually only began in 2012 and was initiated by 350.org, has so far resulted in commitments to divest $6.2 trillion from the fossil fuel industry. On the local level, 350 Austin worked with the City of Austin's Employee Retirement System, or COERS, last year and successfully convinced them to divest 40% of their fossil fuel portfolio. Now, while we want them to be 100% divested, 40% is nonetheless a very significant step which we welcome and applaud. And we were actually thrilled that we were able to meet that, to be able to work and succeed at that level in our first year of existence as an organization. We plan to continue working with COERS, but also with the other two pension funds in the city, the firemen and the policemen, because frankly, you remember those stranded assets, $27 trillion that they're carrying, the fossil fuel industry is carrying on their books as financial assets? That is a huge exposure to investors. And we think it is very bad business for anybody to be invested in this, particularly when people's retirement depends on it. Lastly, we're also committed to closing down the coal-fired Fayette power plant. Austin Energy currently owns 1/3 of this power plant, but they're also in negotiations to be released from that contract by a target date of 2023. We're impatient. We'd like to see it happen sooner, but we want them out of there for sure. However, even if and when they get out, that still leaves Fayette operating. And in recent years, it's been operating at an even higher percentage than it was back before we had as much renewables in our mix as we do now. Very disturbing. So, we think from a climate change perspective, as well as an environmental and a health perspective, all of these, that's absolutely unacceptable that Fayette continue to operate. So we intend to shut it down. We are in a climate crisis that was artificially created by the fossil fuel industry, which for 40 years has funded a campaign of deception and lies about climate change, its imminence, it's here now, and its impact, and has therefore stymied migration to renewable energy sources. And the thing that's really annoying about this, I mean, that's bad enough, but the thing that's really annoying is they have taken off the table the best way of doing that, which is slow, incremental change. We don't have that option anymore because we're out of time. We have to move fast. Continued business as usual is unacceptable, if we as a species fail to take serious and dramatic action very soon, we're going to wind up like these guys. Now, in case you can't see the caption, the dinosaur who's delivering the lecture here to a whole auditorium full of other dinosaurs essentially says, so in summary, the climate's changing, mammals are on the rise, and we all have brains the size of a walnut. Well, brain capacity is not our problem. Technology even is not our problem. Essentially, the technological solutions that we need to stop and even reverse climate change exist today. We have them now. The problem is not that, it's the will to change. So what we look at every year is our greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow, the climate continues to deteriorate, and we as a species march on like lemmings to certain destruction unless we make significant changes. Which raises a question I'm going to use in closing. How might I help to be a part of this must-win battle to stabilize the climate? First of all, I would argue that we need to realize the overall situation that we're in, which I would say is that no political leader and no political party is going to step forward to save us. They're not going to do it. If humanity is going to escape disaster, then it's up to us, the people, to force the issue. We have to make our leaders do what they must do. Here's some ways that each of us can help. And honestly, I know that many of you folks are already doing a lot of these things, and I congratulate you on that, but I'm going to list some of them anyway. It ultimately comes down to two choices: personal choices and group action. On the personal side, if you've not already done so, look for ways that you can, as effectively as you can, reduce your carbon footprint on the world. That will help. Whether that's, if possible, if you can afford it, to install solar panels, or maybe an electric or hybrid car, even down to the level of changing out your light bulbs for LEDs. These things do make a difference. But we need to realize that the problem is so big and so systemic that individual action is not going to solve it. And we're not going to be able to consume our way out of the problem that we have. Which leaves us, I think, in an effort to try to multiply the impact of our individual actions by joining in group efforts. I would argue, especially at the local level, where citizens have much more influence over decision makers than they do above the local level. So, for example, join us as the Green Sanctuary Ministry right here in the First UU has already done in fighting for 100% carbon-free energy generation as soon as possible. Now, I recognize that 350 might not be everybody's cup of tea, but I just want to say, if the things we're doing are not particularly interesting to you, but you want to be a part of this, there are all kinds of other organizations in the Austin area that are working on the same problem from different angles. You could also join with us to help keep carbon in the ground, specifically help us to shut down that Fayette coal plant. If that's not too appealing, you might want to be a part of a more national effort like the No Keystone XL pipeline effort underway, actually nationally but focused in Nebraska, or perhaps the Solar XL campaign also focused in Nebraska. We would welcome your working with us also, like I said, to shut down that Fayette coal plant. Divestment and reinvestment may be open to you as individuals or as organizations. I believe the Unitarian Church has already either divested or certainly fully committed to fully divest within a short time frame. Usually it's about a 3 to 5 year period. It takes a while. You can do this divestment yourself if you own fossil-free securities or even shares in a mutual fund that have significant amounts of fossil fuels in their portfolio. We would really welcome you working with us to help the City of Austin pension plans complete that divestment, all three of them, and get out of fossil fuels. Another way to be involved in this, many call it divestment, is really more of a bank boycott, to move your financial resources out of a bank and into a credit union. Why? Because every single national bank in the country invests very heavily in fossil fuels. Most regional banks do, and for that matter, in Texas, darn near every local bank does too. So the only safe way to do it is get out of there, take your money to a credit union where they do not invest in fossil fuel projects. That's very effective because it literally takes money out of the fossil fuel industry's pockets. They have to borrow money or get lines of credit to do any of these big projects. And we move our resources elsewhere, it hits them right where it hurts, the only place they have any nerve endings. These are just a few local opportunities in which each of us can make a difference. And like I said, I know many of you have already done a lot of these things. I know a lot of you are already involved with other people working toward this same common goal. And that is very encouraging, and I thank you very much. But I just want to kind of end with this thought as I talk about this one topic, which is that even every little bit, every stance taken in opposition to the fossil fuel industry, every word spoken in support of the new low-carbon economy that we must produce, each of these things is like another grain of sand being added to the scale to offset the power of the fossil fuel industry. Tipping points are real, just as they are in climate change. They're real also in social movements, and we need to create a tipping point against climate change and the forces driving it. So if you're not involved now, but you want to find a way to contribute to this life and death struggle for our planet, the movement will welcome you with open arms. There is a place in this fight for absolutely every human being, regardless of what you think you can or cannot do. Every skill imaginable is needed in this effort, and you will be welcomed with open arms. So in conclusion, I just wanted to note that my generation and even that of my children were fortunate enough to be born into a breathtakingly beautiful world. Although the processes were already well underway that, if not checked, will ruin this, as far as we know, unique place. This beautiful green and blue oasis in the vast, inhospitable expanse of space is the only home we're ever going to have. There is no escape hatch. There is no planet B. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Gil. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and so please keep your questions very short so that Mr. Starkey can answer as many as possible.
350 does happen. The question was, does 350 meet anywhere? And the answer to that is, yes, indeed it does. Right here in First UU Church, every third Tuesday. At the moment, I think we're meeting in House and Hall. That'll depend on construction. But First UU has been incredibly gracious and hospitable. A lot of places I know would not have opened their doors to someone like us while they're trying to renovate their whole structure, but First UU has done that. Third Tuesday.
Dale Beulah, first of all, I hope that you'll be here Tuesday night this week and pose some of these questions to our mayoral candidates that'll be here at First UU this Tuesday evening at 6:30, because they need to have their feet held to the fire when they're going to be running our government for the next 4 years. The other thing is that you really didn't mention much about the massive amount of taxpayer subsidies that keep these fossil fuel companies alive, over $20 billion with a B every year. I think that ought to be a bipartisan thing, to not keep giving these people money that are killing us.
Couldn't agree with you more, Dale. We really need to cut out the fossil fuel industries. The $20 billion had to be the U.S. because I know globally it's well over $1 trillion every single year. We can't control what other countries do. We have some hope anyway of doing something here. Political environment makes that really tough, but you're absolutely right. That type of subsidy is a killer, and we need to stop that.
Yeah, this is Bob Hendricks. You mentioned the focus on local as opposed to national, and as I'm aware, almost every organization agrees that that's where the most will be done. However, I'd like you to comment on the need to still work on the national level. For example, the Sierra Club has led an effort to delay the ending of methane leak regulations by over a year. We probably won't succeed, but even the delaying tactics seems to me like have some good to continue to work on the national level.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I tend to agree with that. It goes back to the every grain of sand idea. I mean, just gumming up the works buys us a little bit more time, and we need time more than anything. So yeah, that's not going to be our focus because we're committed to a local focus, and we feel like we're very fortunate here in Austin to have a city council and city commissions that show real interest in working with us. So that's where we're going to focus, but anything you can do to gum up the works on the fossil fuel industry's progress, I'd say, is a wonderful thing.
Hello, Richard Halpin here at First UU. Thank you for your terrific, wasn't he terrific? Wasn't that an exceptional speech? Really, excellent. Is it true that people, I think I saw somebody here in a 350 Austin shirt. Isn't it true that people are wearing these shirts and they're showing up at meetings around town, and they've already gotten the attention of elected officials and community energy leaders who are already being moved and motivated by these people showing up to be more aware of their game and to at least do a better chance at talking about changing things? Tell us about these shirts and where they're showing up and what inspiration they're providing.
Yeah, Dale's wearing one. If you can stand up and model it. Thank you, Dale. Actually,
Here's
these
the shirt.
shirts have
Mr. Buell, if you
been...
stand up again, please.
Yeah. I'm sure you'll be approached by an agent afterwards for a modeling contract. And yeah, Martha Carlton here on the front row actually designed these shirts, and I don't know if you still have any on your person or not, but the point that Richard made is right on. Martha designed these shirts. We've been providing them to our membership, selling them to those who can afford to buy them, and showing up at various meetings, City Council, the Austin Energy Utility Oversight Commission, the Electricity Oversight Utility Oversight Commission, the Joint Sustainability Commission, and we are noticed. First and foremost, at the EUC, because we really started our efforts there. And as Austin Energy was completing a presentation recently, one of the commissioners turned to them and said, well, what about this specific issue? That's what the shirts are interested in. How do you answer that? And that just underscored the fact that we're not doing anything obnoxious. We're just showing up. We make comments during citizens communication, but we're letting them know we're here, we're watching, and we'll take action as we need to. We'll work with you if we can. If we can't, we won't, and we'll go outside. But we're here, and it's really having an impact. The mayor noticed, believe me, the first time he ever saw us, and there was only 8 of us, and we went up to say hi afterwards, and he didn't know what was coming at him. I think he said, whoa, and then he figured out we weren't really going to create a problem, and we had a good discussion.
We only have about 5 minutes left, and so we can have 2 short questions.
I think that little country of France has most of their power energy from atomic. You can correct me, atomic power plants. So why can't we do more of that? Why can't we cut out the coal power plant that is in this area? Why can't you do it? Why can't it be done?
Yeah, very good question. And it comes down, frankly, to a section in this talk I had to cut out due to time. But it's really a capitalist ideology question. It's also in a broader context than that, but the point behind that is you're right, there's no reason that coal plant needs to keep running. We have alternative methods that we can generate even more electricity than that thing is, and do so without polluting the environment, killing people, or driving up global warming. That is totally possible, but there are no plans, and we asked the general manager of the LCRA directly. The LCRA is the majority partner. They own 2/3, we own 1/3. They have no plans to shut down that plant, none. And the reason is, at the moment, theoretically, they're making money. Now, there's some question as whether that's really true, but that's why they're running it at a higher rate, is to generate funds.
Joe Linsalata, and to tie in of her question now, can Austin really stop getting electricity from non-renewable sources like coal, or is there what's 350's plan? Is there just going to be massive solar fields, or what's atomic power plants? I'm not sure if that's a good idea.
No, I agree with you. I don't think it's a pretty good idea, but I don't think you have to worry about new atomic power plants being built for a couple of reasons. They're so expensive, it takes so long to do it, that from what I understand, nobody expects that to happen here or basically anywhere else in the country for those reasons. But yes, we can run off of renewables. The biggest objection to renewables from the industry, from the utility industry, has been they're not dispatchable. And by the way, the sun doesn't shine at night, and the wind doesn't always blow. And these are true. That is true, that is the case sometimes. But the technology is here and is being refined and is becoming cheaper by the month and year to store that energy in any number of ways and then dispatch it as needed, whether that's at night or whenever. So Austin Energy is, in fact, involved in a pilot right now, which I'm sure you've heard of. It's a SHINES project. And they are working to store energy in batteries. Battery technology's come a long way in just 3 years. So that's going to be an alternative. There are many other ways to store that energy and then be able to dispatch it later. Yes, we can go to renewables, and that is doable now.
Gil Starkey, thank you for a starkly realistic and challenging presentation today. Thank you for your work with 350.org, and thank you for being here.